This week's story is set at the end of World War II and portrays a fictional attempt to detonate a nuclear bomb on Berlin. But everything is not quite as it seems. Report of Dr. Aubrey Pritchard, July the 12th, 1947. I have been asked to write a short, informal account of the history of my patient, Flight Lieutenant Roger Bennett. In order to understand the nature of Bennett's delusions, it is necessary to understand the shocking experience he endured at the end of the war in February of 1945. I have interviewed extensively all the main characters involved in this disturbing sequence of events and have reconstructed key dialogues where possible, utilising a minimum of dramatic licence. While the vagaries of human memory make it impossible to reproduce historical dialogue word for word, I have made every effort to ensure the utmost accuracy. In preparing this account, I have also leaned heavily on detailed contemporary intelligence reports. Every aspect of Bennett's behaviour was meticulously observed at the time. I will attempt to describe the sequence of events largely as they must have appeared to Bennett, in order to better facilitate understanding of Bennett's psychological state. Bennett was known informally to his colleagues during the war by the moniker of Chalky. Two other key players in this horrifying tragedy include Flying Officer Gerald Fielding, known as Ginger, and Sergeant Arnold Davey, known as Squiffy. All three men were selected for their intelligence, their ability to remain calm under intense pressure, and their moral character. All three men had participated extensively in the bombing of civilian targets. On the 23rd of January 1945, Bennett, Fielding and Davey were summoned to a meeting at RAF Norfolk. Squadron leader Michael Fisk was present at this meeting, as was Professor Stephen Blaise from the University of Oxford. The meeting took place in a room used only for briefings of the utmost secrecy, in a building somewhat distant from the barracks and mess hall. "Gentlemen," said Fisk, "you have all been selected for a mission of the greatest importance, a mission which will likely bring the war to a conclusive stop and save the lives of many thousands of people. Needless to say, none of you must breathe a word of what I am about to tell you to anyone who is not a part of this mission, on pain of death. The Americans have developed a new type of bomb, an atomic bomb, which uses the internal processes of the atom to generate incredible quantities of energy in the blink of an eye. The Germans, as you know, are in essence defeated, and yet they continue to fight, along with the Japs and some of the Italian forces who have fallen under German occupation. Your mission, gentlemen, will be to drop an atomic bomb on Berlin, destroying the city completely. And what is more, sending a clear message to the Axis powers. We believe this mission will end the war." At this point there was some brief discussion among the three selected men. "Over to you, Professor," said Fisk. Professor Blaise then took the floor, and a slide of the weapon was displayed. "Gentlemen, you are looking at a nuclear bomb," he said. "It is not necessary for you to know precisely how this device operates internally. It is sufficient for you to know that when activated, a core of uranium is compressed, initiating an instantaneous chain reaction which will release a devastating burst of energy. Anything within a 2-mile radius will be vaporized. Any building within 4 miles will be flattened. The weapon produces a characteristic fiery cloud in the shape of a mushroom, which we expect will exert a powerful psychological effect on anyone unfortunate enough to witness it. The bomb is equipped with altitude and acceleration sensors, which will cause it to detonate automatically when dropped. You will have approximately 20 seconds to get as far away as possible from the detonation site. We cannot guarantee your survival, but our calculations show that you will have a high chance of survival providing you fly at maximum speed while dropping 5,000 feet. However, if you should for any reason be forced to perform an emergency landing somewhere, The bomb will not detonate. Your rate of descent will be too slow to trigger the mechanism. Forced landings should be avoided if humanly possible. If it should nevertheless prove necessary, you must activate the bomb by hand, sacrificing your lives for your country. The bomb cannot be allowed to fall into enemy hands. 16 valves placed all around the bomb casing must be unscrewed and then pushed firmly into place. A series of switches must then be activated in the correct order. Your deaths will be instantaneous and painless. Fisk then took the floor again. The three of you will be flying a modified Lancaster. You will spend the next 3 days practicing arming a replica of the weapon in case of forced landing. Pray you won't need to do it. Are there any questions? When are we going? Said Fielding. The other two men laughed. 3 days, perhaps longer, depending on weather, said Fisk. Who's forming the rest of the crew? Said Davy. You will fly alone, said Fisk, just the three of you. What about gunners and navigators? Said Bennett. You won't need them, said Fisk. You will follow a marked Spitfire to your target. The route will be prepared for you by an entire squadron. Your complete focus will be on flying the plane and dropping the bomb. You, Bennett, will be tasked with taking direct responsibility for the weapon. Davy, you will be the flight engineer, and you, Fielding, will fly the plane. However, all of you must be prepared for all possible duties. If we succeed in dropping the bomb, said Bennett, what are our chances of being able to get away from the blast fast enough to survive? Can you put a figure on it? You're asking if this is a suicide mission, said Fisk. It's not. A weapon like this has never been deployed from a plane before, but our best scientists, including Dr. Blaze, believe you have at least a 50% chance of survival if you get out of there as fast as you can and don't hang about. During the brief training period, the men were segregated from other members of the squadron. They were allocated a room in which to pass the evenings, complete with drinks and a deck of cards and a dartboard. The room was fitted with covert cameras, so the men's state of mind could be monitored. The footage from that evening is perhaps the most interesting of all the footage that was recorded in connection with the mission. I will note here only one conversation that took place between the men, since I think it rather encapsulates Bennett's state of mind. "Squiffy, did you volunteer for this?" said Bennett, while taking aim with a dart. "No," said Davy. "What about you, Ginger?" said Bennett. "Me neither, old boy," said Fielding. "You?" "No," said Bennett. "If you've got cold feet," began Fielding. "I haven't got cold feet," said Bennett. "We might not come back from this one," said Fielding. "So what's new?" said Bennett. "What an incredible lark though," said Davy. "It might just be the greatest lark of all time," said Bennett, smiling. "The Boche is going to wish he'd stayed at home and taken up knitting," said Davy. All three men laughed. "Why do people say they've got cold feet anyway?" said Fielding. "I mean, what's it got to do with feet?" "You know," said Davy, "sometimes when I get the fear my feet go cold, like the blood drains from them. Sort of tingling sensation. You boys know what I mean?" "No," said Fielding. "Get that often, do you?" "Often enough," said Davy. "What about you, Chalky?" said Fielding. "I don't even know what fear is," said Bennett. "Maybe you should have taken up knitting, Squiffy." And he smiled, and the other men laughed. The following day the three men were ushered into a run-down hangar, where Fisk introduced them to Dr. Herzog. Standing within the hangar was a second structure, containing the replica weapon. Herzog waved them through, and the men walked around it, inspecting it. "I hope you don't mind me asking," said Davy, "but are you all right, Doctor?" Dr. Herzog appeared to be in the last stages of a fatal illness. He was wheezing, heavily stooped, and his skin was covered in ugly reddish patches. He was completely bald and had no eyebrows. "I don't mind," he said. "It's the radiation exposure. The weapon, the real one, not this, contains uranium. It continually emits atomic rays. I have spent a great deal of time in close proximity with the core." He smiled. "It's a small price to pay for putting an end to the war." Could the same happen to us? Said Davy. I mean, don't get me wrong, if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. I just don't want it to interfere with my flying ability. No, said Herzog. The dose you will absorb during the flight and the subsequent explosion will be perfectly tolerable. Now, if you please, gentlemen, we will practice arming the replica. On the evening of the following day, Bennett was allowed to return home to visit his wife and children. His house had been carefully wired with concealed microphones, so that all conversations could be monitored. Due to this, we know that he informed his wife, Charlotte, that he had been selected for a special mission. On the tapes, she can be heard telling him that he had better return home in one piece, and imploring him to think of his daughters. Bennett can be heard telling her that the matter is in God's hands, and that he will do everything within his power to return home safely. I have listened to all the recordings made of Bennett's house from that evening and the following morning. There is not the slightest sign in any of them that he had doubts about his mission whatsoever, nor did he overstep his bounds in sharing information about the mission with Mrs. Bennett. From the point of view of his duty as an officer of His Majesty's Royal Air Force, Bennett's behaviour was impeccable. In the evening, Flight Lieutenant Bennett read a bedtime story to his youngest daughter, Isabel. There is every reason to think Bennett was a loyal and devoted husband and an excellent father. On the 27th of January at 1 p.m, the three men watched as the bomb was loaded onto a modified Lancaster. Bennett shivered in the cold air. The bomb was no more than 5 feet high and precisely resembled its replica, but the impression it made on him was incomparably monstrous. As Bennett reminded Davy later that day, within the blackish metal exterior lay an unholy power previously controlled only by God himself, a power equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, but absurdly concentrated. The loading crew handled the bomb with extreme care. Herzog stood by, watching, leaning heavily on a stick due to the weakness the bomb's unearthly rays had occasioned in him. At 9 p.m, the men boarded the Lancaster. Fielding piloted the aircraft as already arranged. Davy acted as flight engineer, and Bennett's task was simply to ensure that the bomb was, at all costs, detonated over Berlin. There was little chatter between the men during the 6-hour flight. Bennett sat watching the weapon like a hawk. The Lancaster's intercom was secretly fed into a tape machine which recorded all conversations. Near Bremen, they experienced some brief anti-aircraft flak, but not until they neared Berlin did they begin to come under serious attack. "What do you suppose happens if the bomb's hit?" said Davy over the intercom. "It's not going to explode," Bennett replied. "Worst that happens is it doesn't go off." "That's not the worst that could jolly well happen," said Davy. "Oh," said Bennett. "No, worst that happens is it goes off with me sitting next to it," said Davy. "If Jerry gets hold of it, they'll fly it to England and drop it on you and your girl, and probably your mother as well," said Bennett. "That's a thought," said Davy. "Why don't you fellows consider shutting your mouths?" said Fielding, rather amiably. "Charming," said Davy. At that moment a loud explosion can be heard on the tape. "Mars is gone," said Fielding, referring to the port inner engine. "Status, Squiffy." Sergeant Davy was able to close the engine's fuel line, and after making some checks, announced there was no immediate cause for alarm. "As long as we don't lose another one," said Bennett. 10 minutes to target," said Fielding. "Once the weapon's deployed, we can make do with 2 engines if need be." "We wouldn't get away fast enough," said Davy. "That remains to be seen," said Fielding. For the next several minutes, the sound of anti-aircraft flak hitting the plane can be heard periodically. The level of flak encountered had not been anticipated by the people who had planned the mission. It had been anticipated that German anti-aircraft capability would at that point be depleted by the Advance, Hurricane and Spitfire formations. Either the Germans had managed to resupply, or they had been saving their ammunition specifically for bombers. 5 minutes later, Sergeant Davy spoke, panic in his voice. "Mercury hit," he shouted. referring to the starboard outer engine. "Repeat, Mercury hit." 46 seconds later, Flying Officer Fielding announced, "I think we've lost Mercury, chaps. Down to 2 engines. We're losing altitude." "Where are we, Squiffy?" said Bennett. "Close enough," replied Davy. "Get back here," said Bennett. "Let's dump this thing." Sergeant Davy and Flight Lieutenant Bennett began to operate the levers that would open the bomb doors. The levers jammed and the doors failed to open, for reasons that will be obvious to most readers of this report. "They're not opening," said Bennett. "We're down to 15,000 feet, said Fielding. "Commencing manual operation," said Bennett, without any really discernible hesitation. The time that passed between Fielding's announcement of the declining altitude and Bennett's decision to activate the bomb manually amounted to only 13 seconds. In 13 seconds, he made the decision to sacrifice his life in order to end the war, even though, for all he knew, the bomb doors might still be persuaded to open with further effort. Davy continued to pull on the port side bomb door lever. "I can get it," he shouted. "It's just jammed somewhere." "Negative," said Bennett. Bennett was already beginning to unscrew the 16 valves around the perimeter of the bomb casing and push them in. "One last try," pleaded Davy. 14,000 feet, said Fielding. "Deploy the bloody valves," shouted Bennett, and Davy began to assist him in activating the perimeter valves. Bennett would have known with near certainty at this point that he was about to die. 23 seconds later, a second explosion can be heard on the tape. A large section of fuselage on the starboard side of the aircraft was ripped completely away, and the 2 men were thrown backwards, Bennett narrowly avoiding being sucked out of the gaping hole. This, of course, was entirely unanticipated. "We've lost Venus," shouted Fielding. "Port elevator gone. We're going down." "How long have we got?" shouted Bennett. "Less than a minute," Fielding replied. 11,000 feet. "There isn't time," said Bennett. "You have to land it, Ginger." "I don't think I can do it, chaps," said Fielding. "Then keep us in the air," said Bennett. "Can't do that either," said Fielding. Bennett and Davy attempted to continue deploying the valves, but at this point the movement of the aircraft was erratic and they made very little further progress. 42 seconds later, Fielding said, "I can see Tempelhof. We're coming down. Brace yourselves." "If you land, you're going to have to hold them off with your pistols," said Bennett. "I need another minute, minimum." "We're coming in fast," said Fielding. Landing gears, his subsequent words are indistinct. The Lancaster made an extremely rough landing on runway 7 at Tempelhof Airport, Berlin. It is an enormous testament to Flying Officer Fielding's skill that the plane was able to land at all. The entire operation had very nearly been derailed by the German anti-aircraft guns. During the landing, Bennett and Davy were knocked off their feet, but as the aircraft slowed to a halt, both men resumed working on the weapon, unscrewing the valves. The time was, at that point, 3:13 in the morning, and the grass in between the runways was frozen hard with frost. It was at this point that Davy directed Bennett's attention to 2 figures running towards the aircraft, having broken off from a small crowd of people surrounding a plane that had apparently just landed. "There's children here," shouted Davy. Bennett saw 2 children, a boy and a girl, running towards the aircraft. "Never mind about them," said Bennett. "Activate the bomb." "It's over, Chalky," said Davy. "It's finished." "It's not over," said Bennett, continuing to unscrew the valves. "There's children here, Chalky," said Davy. "There's children everywhere," said Bennett. "They won't suffer." "I said it's finished," said Davy, and he drew his pistol and levelled it at Bennett. At this point Fielding appeared, having clambered out of the pilot's seat. He was bleeding from a gash on his head, but was otherwise unhurt. "What's going on?" he said. The 2 children can be heard on the tape at this point, shouting in German. This is followed by a loud retort as Bennett fired his own pistol at Davy. Davy fell backwards onto the fuselage, where he remained. There can then be heard a single word in German: "Halt." Bennett and Fielding were forced to raise their hands having failed to deploy the weapon. The plane was quickly surrounded by soldiers. Bennett was captured and marched off towards the airport buildings, along with Fielding. He was taken to a basement room where he was strapped to a chair. For half an hour he was left alone, and then a German officer appeared, of rather robust and brutish appearance. 2 German soldiers trailed into the room behind him. "Good morning," said the officer. "I am SS Sturmbannführer Glaser, and you are?" "Flight Lieutenant Roger Bennett, service number 146158, said Bennett. "Excellent," said Glaser. "And what is that thing in your plane?" Bennett said nothing. "Your friend has already informed us it is a bomb," said Glaser. "Tell me, what do you know about it?" Bennett remained silent. At this point, it should be noted, Bennett had already developed the plan that he was about to successfully carry through. Glaser tried again. "Your colleague, Flying Officer Fielding, has informed us that the device is a nuclear bomb. Is this correct?" Bennett said nothing. Glaser sighed. "I really wanted to do it the easy way," he said. "The pleasant way. Unfortunately, time is rather limited." Glaser issued some commands in German to the soldiers, and a machine on a trolley was wheeled in. Electrical wires were attached to Bennett's left ankle and right-hand wrist. For half an hour, they tortured Bennett using the electrical apparatus. Bennett was determined to hold out for at least half an hour, because he needed to render his subsequent confession as plausible as possible in the eyes of the interrogating German officer. I believe the intense pain of the interrogation contributed significantly to Bennett's subsequent mental state, while being neither sufficient nor probably even strictly necessary to producing it. It had not been anticipated that Bennett would hold out for so long. After half an hour, Bennett was about to fake a confession when a second German officer appeared. In English, he said to the first officer, "Thank you, Sturmbannführer Glaser. I'll take it from here." Glaser and the 2 soldiers left the room, taking the torture machine with them. "I'm sorry," he said. "Glaser is an idiot. I wish I had got here sooner." The second officer was tall, blonde, and powerfully built. One of the Aryan supermen, Bennett thought to himself. The officer took a packet of cigarettes from his jacket. "Do you smoke?" he said. Bennett shook his head. "Do you mind if I smoke?" he said. Bennett made no reply. "But I'm being rude," said the man. He shouted something in German and a soldier appeared and unstrapped Bennett, who rubbed his wrists. "I am SS Obersturmbannführer Trost," he said. Then he shouted something else and a soldier brought in a jug of water. Bennett eyed it warily. "Would you like some water?" said Trost. Bennett nodded and Trost poured him a glass. "Would you like coffee?" said Trost. "I think we can even stretch to a tea. I know your English are picky about tea, but perhaps you will find our tea acceptable." Bennett said nothing but sipped the water. "Very well then," said Trost. "I'm sorry about the treatment you have received. If I had got here earlier, it wouldn't have happened. I happened to be passing through on my way to Italy. I think you met my children." Trost followed Bennett's line of sight. "You're wondering if you could grab my pistol," he said. "You could try, but it wouldn't end well." Trost fixed Bennett with piercing blue eyes. "Come on," he said. "You're a smoker, I can tell." He held out the cigarette packet, and Bennett took a cigarette. Trost lit it for him. "Do you have children?" he asked. "2 daughters," said Bennett. This was the first information Bennett had volunteered since his capture, other than his name, rank, and service number. It's clear that he judged this to be the correct point at which to begin to appear to soften in his attitude towards his interrogators as part of his attempt to manipulate them. Trost smiled. "Then you know what it's like to be a father," he said. "We will do anything for our children." Bennett sucked on the cigarette, holding it between 2 shaky fingers. "I'm impressed that you held out for under the torture for so long," said Trost. "Sometimes I wonder if I could do the same." You couldn't, said Bennett. Trost laughed. Then he said something to two soldiers who were standing at the back of the room, and they left and closed the door. Let's talk to each other frankly, he said. Today it's you sitting there in that chair covered in cold sweat. Tomorrow, maybe it's me. Bennett made no reply. Look, said Trost. The war is over. You know it. I know it. Everyone knows it except the Führer. We've lost. He held out his palms to his sides. You have won, he said. You know, the Führer isn't even here in Berlin. He left for somewhere safer. Probably researching suicide methods, said Bennett. Trost laughed. Yeah, he probably is, he said. For some moments, Trost giggled quietly to himself. Bennett started to wonder if he was quite the full shilling, mentally. Then Trost appeared to pull himself together and became serious again. We would very much like to know what that thing out there on the runway is, he said. I bet you would, said Bennett. Allow me to formulate a hypothesis, said Trost. I would like to suggest that thing out there is a bomb. A powerful bomb. Maybe capable of destroying an entire city. Bennett said nothing. He continued to smoke. He felt himself gradually growing calmer, even optimistic. Or maybe not an entire city, said Trost. Maybe a few square kilometers. The question is, of course, is it going to explode? Or did you lack the necessary time to activate it? Bennett nodded slowly. Very well, said Trost. Let's suppose it's on a timer. It's going to explode. Who knows when? Maybe we can defuse it first. Maybe we can't. Let's suppose we can't. The bomb explodes. Boom. The whole city is destroyed. At least a large part of it. Now tell me, what would be the point of that? What's the point of any of this? Said Bennett. Exactly, said Trost. All war is madness. I've always thought this. There was a knock on the door, and a soldier brought in a cup of coffee. He placed it on a table by Trost's side, and then left again. Trost took it and offered it to Bennett. You look like you need it more than I do, he said. He saw the look in Bennett's eyes and added, It's not poisoned. No truth serums here. He took a large gulp of the coffee to prove it was safe. Bennett took the coffee and drank it quickly. We're not even in the centre of Berlin here, said Trost. We're more than 5 kilometres from Unter den Linden. I already told you the Führer isn't here. The entire High Command have left. The Russians are only kilometres away. This area of Berlin is nearly all civilians. The airport isn't of great strategic interest to you anymore. 3/4 of it is unusable. What would be the point of killing a load of civilians so late in the war? Perhaps you think I'm an idiot, said Bennett. Certainly not, said Trost. Idiots aren't entrusted with a mission like this. I'm telling you the truth. Bennett laughed sarcastically. It doesn't really matter anyway, he said. What do you mean? Said Trost. Bennett smiled grimly, but made no reply. You shot your comrade, said Trost. He died shortly after we reached you. Why did you kill him? Bennett said nothing. Trost leaned forwards and stared deeply into Bennett's eyes, as if searching his soul. If that machine goes off, you'll be remembered as a mass murderer, he said. Nothing more. Your own children will be ashamed of you. Is that what you want? He leaned back. It doesn't have to be like that, he continued. In a few months this war will be over and you could be at home with your family. Suppose you deactivate this bomb. What do you think we can do with it now? Our scientists don't know how it works. We don't have the knowledge or the resources anymore to make it operational. We have no way of using it ourselves. If you deactivate it, we can destroy it and ensure it doesn't fall into the hands of the Russians. I'm sure you don't want that any more than we do. Bennett stubbed out his cigarette and threw it on the floor. It's set to explode, he said. I'd say in about 15 more minutes. Can you deactivate it? Said Trost. I could, said Bennett. I want a written guarantee from you that I'll be treated fairly, and that my role in this will remain a secret. You will have it, said Trost. I swear on my life and on my honour. Bennett wiped the sweat from his face with his hand. Then take me to it, he said. Trost shouted something in German, and the door opened. Bennett rose shakily to his feet. 2 soldiers gently took hold of his arms and walked him out of the building and into a car. They drove swiftly over to the bomb, where the soldiers helped Bennett out of the car. Bennett half fell against the weapon, still shaking from the torture and from stress. There is still time, said Trost. Yes, said Bennett, and he began unscrewing the remaining valves. Do you need help? Said Trost. No, said Bennett. As he was pushing in the last of the 16 valves, a van appeared, racing across the tarmac. It skidded to a halt as Bennett began to activate the first of the switches that would trigger the bomb. The rear doors of the van opened and Fielding emerged, flanked by 2 German soldiers. Stop, he shouted. An officer jumped out of the front of the van and began hurriedly saying something to Trost. Your comrade says you're trying to detonate the bomb, said Trost. He's bluffing, said Bennett. Fielding suddenly broke free from the soldiers and ran at Bennett. For God's sake, man, give it up, he shouted, trying to pull Bennett away from the bomb. There's no point us dying here just to blow up a half-functioning airfield. Bennett pushed him backwards and caught his chin with a right hook. Fielding fell to the ground. Trost and the German officer from the van began jabbering at each other frantically. Bennett continued to activate the switches until finally there was only one left. The officer drew a gun and pointed it at Bennett. Halt, he shouted. Auf Wiedersehen, said Bennett, and he pressed the switch. For a moment the world seemed to Bennett to freeze. I believe that in that moment, something in his mind became broken. He had not expected to remain alive even a second after pressing that switch. He possessed no further mental capability for dealing with the situation. For some seconds he stood there, dishevelled and confused. Then slowly, one by one, the assembled men began to clap. Fielding stood up and began to clap too. Jolly good show, said Trost, suddenly speaking with a perfect English accent. From the back of the van, Davy emerged, followed by squadron leader Michael Fisk. Nice work, old boy, said Davy. Rather lucky we thought to put blanks in your gun. What the deuce is going on? Shouted Bennett. You passed the test, said Fisk. Congratulations. We captured this airfield days ago, said Fielding, or rather, the Russians did, but we were able to strike a deal. Rather lucky they don't know what we're up to, or I doubt they would have been so obliging. At this point, something wholly unexpected occurred. Bennett grabbed Trost's pistol, or rather, he grabbed the pistol from the man he had known as Trost, in reality a man by the name of Edwards, shouted, "Traitor," and shot Fielding in the heart before anyone could stop him. Fielding died instantly. Bennett then attempted to shoot Edwards, but Edwards and the others were able to subdue Bennett before he could do any more damage. Bennett was taken back to the airport buildings, suitably restrained. It was explained to him that he had been the subject of Operation Dilemma. Dilemma had been designed by military intelligence to test the resolve of potential candidates to detonate a nuclear weapon. The top brass had foreseen a possible future war with Russia and had anticipated the need for airmen to deploy new, radically destructive weapons against Russia. A fierce debate had broken out over whether any airman could be relied upon to deploy such a weapon. This was considered an extremely important question, since it was believed that it might only be possible to build 1 or 2 such weapons. It was not known at the time that the Americans were on the verge of constructing 2 nuclear devices with enough plutonium for a third. The heavy flak over the outskirts of Berlin had not been anticipated, but in fact it had taken out only one of the Lancaster's 4 engines. The forced landing was entirely a work of fiction, although it had been made under unexpectedly difficult circumstances, with part of the Lancaster's fuselage blown away and one engine genuinely destroyed, along with one of the tail elevators that control the aircraft's pitch. The weapon, of course, was an inert fake. Unfortunately, Bennett's mind had been completely unmoored by the test. Had I been consulted, I would have recommended against the use of simulated torture, or else the duration of it should have been greatly shortened. It proved to be impossible to convince Bennett that the airport was in fact in the hands of the Allies, and that his colleagues were anything other than traitors, working in collaboration with the Germans, in spite of all evidence to the contrary. Bennett was flown back to England under guard, and there his delusions only became even more florid. In order to maintain his belief that his colleagues were traitors working for the Germans, he proceeded to develop the belief that Britain had lost the war and was under German occupation. He was incarcerated in Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottingham, where he still resides at present. Bennett considers himself a prisoner of war and believes the hospital staff to be German and fervent adherents of Hitlerism. He considers me to be a fanatical Nazi. Perhaps the saddest aspect of the affair, other than the tragic death of Fielding, is that when we brought Bennett's wife and children to visit him under carefully controlled conditions, a step which we had believed might puncture through his delusory belief system, he formed the opinion that his wife had gone over to Nazism and is now a Nazi collaborator. Addendum by Dr. Aubrey Pritchard, 23rd of July, 1961. By September of 1959, Bennett had spent 14 years incarcerated at Rampton. I had spoken with him frequently and had established moderately friendly relations with him, although he maintained an underlying fundamental hostility, and I believe he would have attempted to kill me had the opportunity presented itself. It had been suggested that prefrontal lobotomy might be of therapeutic benefit, a suggestion that I repeatedly vetoed on the grounds that there was nothing fundamentally wrong with Bennett's brain. It was simply that, under the influence of enormous stressors, a delusional belief system had taken root in it. I had made a habit of showing newspapers to Bennett in the hope that he would understand that the Allies had in fact won the war, and that he, Bennett, was incarcerated in a perfectly ordinary psychiatric facility in post-war England. I have written extensively elsewhere about the technical psychological aspects of Bennett's fascinating delusions. Here I would only like to remark that Bennett is fundamentally a man of deep convictions. This is part of his personality structure. It was this same evident unreflective sense of conviction that caused him to be selected for Operation Dilemma. And yet, once unendurable stress had caused a fundamental shift in his belief system, the new set of beliefs became just as strongly entrenched as his earlier beliefs, and in fact became seamlessly intertwined with them. Bennett clung to his belief that he was now a prisoner of war and his wife a traitor living in occupied England, with the exact same fervour that he had previously clung to the idea that his own life should be sacrificed in the noble cause of ending the war. In late September, I happened to show Bennett an article which announced the Russian development of the first intercontinental ballistic missiles, a development which obviated the need for bomber crews to drop nuclear weapons on target countries. At the time, I did not anticipate the possible significance of this article to Bennett, but it prompted a remarkable change in his behaviour. He sat for a long time staring into space before asking me the poignant question, "Am I insane?" I was subsequently able to secure permission to take Bennett outside the hospital under strict supervision. A military guard was to accompany Bennett at all times, in addition to myself. We allowed Bennett to wander around looking at newspaper stands and bookshops. He repeatedly asked startled passers-by who won the war, and on several occasions attempted to catch members of the public off guard by suddenly shouting at them in German, Bennett having picked up quite a bit of German from a book during his long confinement. Eventually he asked to see his wife, and we were able to arrange a visit for the following day. She had remained faithful to him for the entire period of incarceration. I was present during the meeting for the sake of Charlotte's safety, and I observed Bennett demanding that she tell him the truth on the question of whether Britain had indeed won the war. Bennett eventually broke down in tears, pleading for forgiveness. He made excellent progress over the following months, and I was able to secure his release on the 3rd of March 1960. I strongly recommend that no such test ever again be performed on military personnel. Thank you for listening. You've been listening to Science Horror. My name's John Purcell, and all the stories on this channel are written by me. Next week I have a story for you about swarms of weaponised cockroaches. I'm still working on it, but I think it might just be the most disgusting story I've ever written so far. Do join me again next Monday for that, if that sounds like something you could tolerate. If you enjoyed this week's story, please go back in time and persuade the people who refused to let Hitler into art school to let him in after all. That would really save a lot of trouble, and I believe ultimately help my YouTube stats. Thank you so much. Until next time, have a good week and sleep well.